Hello, hi. My name is Pierre, and I'm super honored to be invited to start this panel with a short presentation about simplifying data sovereignty and an emphasis to reuse existing vocabularies. There are many definitions out there for data sovereignty. However, they all converge towards control of data access, usage, where it's coming, and what it will be used for data privacy, terms and conditions. And also, if we are mentioning personal data, then what about the consent, the traceability of the consent, and the authorization? Because data are always generated within a context, a domain, additional regulation and specific compliance scheme might also apply. For example, health, finance, transport, energy, manufacturing are the ones that we can quickly think of. On top of that, depending on where this is happening on the globe, you have different legal jurisdiction that applies. In Europe, we have GDPR, the Data Act, the Data Governance Act, and a few others. But you have alternative to the GDPR outside of Europe. For example, in Brazil, in Singapore, in many different states in the US, such as California and Virginia states. And when you are combining all of that together, then you figure out that there are common requirements to achieve this data sovereignty. It's the capacity to perform contracting activities and to have semantic interoperabilities. So what does it mean? Well, let's start by common policies. Out of the policy can be derived procedures and rules. For example, know your customers, know your business, the anti-money laundering rules, AML rules. Next, what are the contracting procedures to perform a data exchange? Do the contracting party needs extra conformity assessment? How to perform them? What is the difference between an accreditation, a declaration, a certification, an attestation? Are we talking about verification or validation? Those words are key for semantic interoperability and our capacity to really be in charge, be in control, to have transparency and understanding of what's happening. Then information model to describe state machines and flows. Data require infrastructure, network, storage, compute. And as the infrastructure architecture becomes more and more complex and advanced, we need to have common reference model to enable services to be combined together. Right delegation, for example, from a human to a human, from a human to a machine, from machine to machine. And again, that goes through right delegation, so the ability to express your policy in a language. All of that can be achieved with common vocabularies. Someone might say that, well, we need to agree on standards. And there is a trap with standards. That's the trend to keep creating one, the not invented here syndrome, which in fact has the opposite results of the desired effect by creating even more silos and increasing fragmentation. At Gaia, we emphasize on the reuse of existing either standard de facto, meaning that's used by the industry, or standard de jure from, for example, CNCF, ETSI, ISO, to avoid the situation where we believe we create something awesome, but they are not used. So back to the contract and semantic. The contracting part is a very interesting mix of both legal and tech. Contract can go from buy a house in front of the notary showing your passport, your digital your state-issued identity, to something simple like inserting coins into a vending machine. And by definition, those both extremes of that are defined by the same principles in the European civil law. A contract, that's a legally binding agreement that is governed by the freedom of contracting. You need to be able to enter the contract in a free will. The binding force, you intend to be legally bound to that agreement. The absence of formalities, which doesn't necessarily apply in the digital world, because you will have formalities even for like electronic signature. And the contractual fairness. Contractual fairness is out of scope for today's panel, but that's one of the GAIA's fundamental pillars that we address through our GAIA policy rules, which basically it's how do we translate European values when performing data exchange. All those principles can benefit from more supervised computer-assisted tools. For example, we can work on common procedure for contracting. Do you enable digital signature? Which type of signature? What type of keychain? Where do you store the trust anchors of those keychain? How do you handle storage and the confidentiality? You want your contract once signed to be immutable. And there is a trade-off between immutability and confidentiality. What about the exchange format that we have to agree on without and having to reinvent all the and adapt to all our existing workflow? Then the second step, which is slightly different, that's common clauses, common template. That's about the contract itself and how reasoning can be performed on the contract. So this is not just automating the process, but it's assisting on the reasoning on the clauses. And for that, you need to have, again, common vocabularies. On the right side, I'm showing a state machine that Gaia is using for contracting negotiation part for data exchange. And this is coming from the IDSA data space protocol, where you see the flow, which can be summarized by you have a request from the consumer to the provider make an offer, both parties negotiates and come to an agreement. The agreement is signed by both parties with the intent to be legally bound to that agreement. At last, our recommendation is to lean more on the open digital right information model and vocabularies. This model can be used already to describe access and usage policy, request, offer, agreement. This model is also capable to express basic regulatory policies such as GDPR. It can be extended using simple knowledge organization, data catalog product, DCAT, data privacy vocabularies. It can also be used as an intermediate language between a high-level domain-specific language used in finance, in tax offices, in legal, and low-level code execution such as Rigo, which is used within the CNCF ecosystem. Finally, this is already in use by several organizations in the industry. I will name a few of them, for example, BDVA, Fireware, obviously Gaia X, IDSA, the storage project from the W3C, and many more. Thank you very much for your time. And as a one-line takeaway, if you want to know which data space you need, then tell me how you are performing contracting. I'm very eager to start the panel.
Well, my name is Jesus Alonso. I am leading the association BAIDATA, which is an association that aims to help to Spanish and Portuguese companies and organizations, also public administrations, to move into data economy. So we provide them guidance, technical, but also legal, and on the legal agreements and all that. And that's why, basically, I was invited to this roundtable. So, Enrique.
Okay, my name is Enrique Areizaga. I was the former CEO in a startup, mainly based on telecommunications. 2 years ago, I joined the technological research center Tecnalia. It's one of the biggest R&D centers in Europe. I am within Tecnalia. I am part of the group which is called Digital Course, which is mainly devoted for digital transformation, more precisely how to join a little bit what Gaia is doing, how to merge the cloud infrastructure together with the data space. Also just work collaborating with BAIDATA for data spaces, and also collaborating with not with Gaia X. Also, in fact, we were part of the organization team that were in charge of the technological event last May, together also with BAIDATA. It was one of our sponsors. And I'm also part of the data space support centers related with the governance, more precisely with data governance and business models.
Hello, I'm Andrew Martin, founder and CEO at ControlPlane. We are a cloud-native security consultancy specializing in unlocking next-generation technologies for regulated industries, financial services, healthcare, anybody who really genuinely cares about the sanctity and correctness of their data. I also do some community work. I'm the pro bono CISO at Open UK, where we work to try and advise the UK government on avoiding erroneous legislation, let's say. So sitting in the same kind of space as some of the cyber resiliency acts that we see coming out of Europe, and some of the Biden ordinances we see coming out of the United States. And I'm the co-chair at the CNCF's Technical Advisory Group on Security, where we attempt to assist projects that come through the CNCF in ultimately threat modeling, understanding what their problem space, what their attack surface looks like, and then offering broad general guidance to harden the project, but also make it easier for operators to deploy securely to support their graduation through the CNCF.
Hey everyone, I'm Ben, CTO and co-founder of Armo, Kubernetes security startup based in Israel. From my background, I come from mainly the offensive part of the security space. But in the last, as an entrepreneur, in the last years, I dealt with a lot of data protection, security solutions we've created and tried to implement in the industry. Today, I'm one of the maintainers of Kubescape, of the CNCF Kubernetes security project, and that's it.
Okay, so recently in Europe, there are these two big regulations that have been launched or are being implemented, which are the Data Act and the Data Governance Act. And as Bart mentioned, there's coming next the AI Act. So Europe somehow realized, not only Europe, also other countries, but of course we're focusing now here. Europe has realized that there's certain need to regulate this because it's the future, because it's coming, and data. Not only personal data, which was already covered by GDPR, but also industrial data and other kind of data needs to be somehow protected or give some protections. The big problem that we are facing now, that these regulations have been already written, is how to implement them in the companies and how to go from. So how companies can make sure that their data strategies and the data internal governance and so on are compliant with this regulation. So first, Enrique, and as a well-knower of these regulations and what's the strategy of Europe in this aspect, I would like to ask you to provide us some initial.
Maybe my colleagues will know more. I will just give a little bit of what we have found so far while trying just to, as you say, in Europe, precisely in Europe, they are becoming very strict regarding the usage of the data and all data, not only personal data. They started with the GDPR. Funny thing, in one of these European projects that we are in, in fact, it was for personal data. And it was an enabler for, this is an example, sometimes it's funny when you see the reality. When you just, you need just to enable the people just to move from one country to another for job, for study, because the people didn't rely much on giving their personal data away when they are moving from one country to another, because if they would like to find a job or whatever. So in Europe you have the GDPR, okay, so you have to protect your data. And so we work on a system so that the people were the sovereign of the data, so that they can just give consent for every data that was coming out of the mobile phones. The result is, for customer, is too complex. Okay? So what they want is just one button that says, give consent to everything, to all the services. And the most promising thing at the end was, as well as in the previous presentation, a button that enables them to say revoke all consents. So it's either enable everything or revoke all things. Well, that's a funny story. This one is across. But it's the funny thing is also when you go to these people from the data spaces support centers, they put a lot of effort on data governance, but then when you go there and see which is the companies that are working on that, most of them are coming from the universities or academic background. So sometimes, and they also are trying to work on the business model. So sometimes they're doing a great job. I'm not saying they are not doing that. They focus a lot of, okay, you have to have these usage policies and so on and so forth, but then at the end you have to have a business behind it, okay? And that's a little bit what Gaia is doing. Yes, first, the people that they would like to play, they need to trust. Otherwise, they will have tremendous things, fantastic things, but then no one is going just to give away the data. So how we do that? So how we convince the people just to do that? How we just think that they will provide the governance so that the data will not be hacked, will not be used for other means that they are supposed to be done. Well, I guess I'm extending a lot. Sorry for that. So that, I mean, there are things moving on. There are things that IDSA is also moving. Still a long way to go, I guess, that we will reach. And just my message there, at least in Europe, they are going to be very strict on that. So we will need just to find a way so that all the data governance is done in the right way. And that will be also the reason why data spaces will become a reality. Sorry. Okay.
And you mentioned that you had a long experience on highly regulated sectors, so somehow you're used to deal with this kind of regulations. What are the main challenges for the companies when they face these kind of regulations that is strict? And
yeah, absolutely. The key to successfully managing data at any scale is to understand the different sensitivities and classifications. So in the kind of one button gives all access, I think you can look at this in the same way as OAuth claims for APIs. So you used to say to Google, give access to all your files on Drive. And now they've delineated it so that applications can use only their folders and only subfolders. It's the same with personally identifying information. Probably my name is probably shared quite a lot, so is my email address. My genetic makeup, probably want to keep that to myself. But this big bucket of permissions then suddenly becomes necessary to delineate. So the way that we've approached this when dealing with large digital transformations and cloud-native security renaissances and this kind of thing is a classification of each piece of data, its flow through the system, and this can be done most easily with something like a threat model, where the precursor to that is an architectural understanding of what's being built, and then data flow diagrams. That's the opportunity to say, does this make sense to transit this information over this maybe less trusted node, etc. And when we get to the kind of call and dependency graph that this legislation is going to end up with, where that data can possibly go, be stored, what about its security during transmission, who holds the keys to ultimately decrypt it in various different places. These things have to be quantifiable because of the unbounded complexity that otherwise will follow. So I hope there's a threat model for everything. That would be my strong advice.
okay, so and then you also are related with cyber security and yeah, maybe the legislation is not so much about cyber security, but of course it's another great challenge when you have data. How can companies protect themselves from? Of course, it's a huge question, but
yeah, this is what I wanted to say to you. That like you are going with this question to something like really huge. But
no, but when we're talking about sharing data that is sensitive, either it's personal or maybe business related, what are the key elements that have to be?
Yeah. So I think that what Andy said about threat modeling, and this just threat modeling, I mean, it's the whole concept of understanding what do you have. Like it's sometimes today, in today's world, it's very easy to like be pulled into different things with the velocity of the development and cloud and deployment is like there is the product comes up with a new requirement, storing something, and it's very easy for to the development team to see, well, okay, I will just take this requirement and turn into a new S3 bucket with a new Lambda function or something, and sometimes simply this part of threat modeling, this part of like designing the system ahead of time to be data conscious is lagging behind. So it's much more reactive than proactive. And I think that the major part is to be conscious about it. Like code or something, and then it turns into a big problem. So being conscious and understanding and adding it as a process is the major key part for everyone.
Also, another, for me, big challenge for companies when they face this is that, of course, regulation in Europe is the one that is being prepared. In UK, we have another legislation, and in Singapore, in South Korea, and so. Alberto, Enrique, how do you see the European legislation in front of others, or?
Well, I am European, so,
No, of course.
so that's good.
No, I mean, let me clarify.
Yeah.
Europe has probably a background of being more protective and more regulatory than others. How do companies, how can they, I mean, Europe, the legislation, of course, it affects to Europe, but it also affects external companies or international companies that want to operate in Europe.
Yeah.
In some cases, in a really high level.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that line I was.
Well, I try to elaborate a little bit my personal perception. It's true, Europe is famous for having laws almost for everything, which means that we have a lot of bureaucracy, and which is sometimes good for the protection of your data, but sometimes from the business point of view, from the company point of view, it implies a lot of additional effort just to comply with everything which is done in the Data Act or Data Governance Act that has been released, the data recently, and they will come in force very soon. Well, in fact, the first one has already become in force. So you go there to the companies and just try to explain them what are the consequences of Data Act. For example, Pierre from Gaia X, if you know a little bit about the ecosystem of Gaia X, they are even defining something what they call labels. Okay, and these labels will identify if, for example, if the storage of your data is in Europe. Okay, so you need just to have the information coming from this company, and they can have to be in Europe. Okay, you cannot store anywhere else. So that has a lot of implications for the companies. Okay, so, but this is part of the ecosystem that are working on. But then you go to the real world, and then you just also one of them is trying to define what is a data product. Okay, like the business model, most simplified business model, and you go to the companies and they don't know exactly what they have. They don't know exactly how to define the data product. So unless there are other companies that helped them to try and to figure out how to make this a reality, and I am not saying that the Data Act is wrong. I think it's perfect. Okay, but what I am saying is that we will need to support, or someone will need to support companies just in this path toward the compliance of these laws that are recently released by the European Commission or the European Parliament. Sorry.
And regarding the United Kingdom, since Brexit, of course, this legislation is not directly affecting you, but how is, I don't know if you have some insights on how is it seen from the United Kingdom, all this kind of legislation?
I mean, the GDPR legislation was a breath of fresh air. It was the first time that really there's a sort of transnational movement to care about the end user. So very pleased that exists. I think these things make a lot of sense. The United Kingdom, to some extent, if we compare the approach that the US is taking, where they're really moving very quickly and interoperating with open source communities, the UK is kind of somewhere in the middle, where they're asking questions but really just observing and seeing where the rest of the world's moving. And the European Union is seen as leading the path outside of the US. For this, the fact that GDPR still affects US companies is glorious and has increased security for everybody. In terms of what that means from a concrete implementation level, sort of from a Kubernetes-centric perspective, the dream of service mesh and zero trust was actually to be able to do context-aware routing. So you might have, and this is completely untenable with modern technology because of latency and the speed of things at the moment, but this dream that actually if you have a service mesh proxy in front of all your applications, then you tag the data, and if that data is tagged as European-centric or cannot move outside of country of origin, then it's routed appropriately over the mesh. Now, I still think that's potentially an impossibility for at least a few years. The overhead of all these things means that other systems will be faster, and then sort of commercially, from a capitalist market perspective, probably won't end up beating incumbent solutions. But this concept of really understanding truly from a zero trust perspective, what is the data in addition to sort of always trust but verify, what is the actual content of the request that's coming, leads to, I think that's where the next generation of these things will go, even if it's not multinational deployments. But certainly within the European Union at least, legislation will push some solutions in this direction.
Okay, thank you. And now Ben, from Israel, I think there's a long history between Israel and Europe. I mean, it's not Europe, but there are many bonds. I don't know if you have a perception of if there is some affection or some impact.
So Israel is taking here, Israel is very interesting because from a cultural perspective, it has its really, very serious bonds with Europe, but from an economical perspective, it's more bounded to the United States. And the interesting thing is that Israel is, I think right now, is walking its own way, both independent from what's happening in the States and what's in Europe. There are multiple legislations which are started to manage the same, going to the same directions as GDPR, but they are not as complex and not as big as GDPR itself. But there is, I do see from the government perspective, I do see a very conscious decision to make practical solutions for consumers. Like the government is running programs where they are not trying to solve things from legislation saying, okay, you have to manage the data like this and you have to give consent like that. It's like more, okay, I want this ministry to open a service where I can go as a citizen and I can see where is my data stored, and to tell the companies that, okay, you must delete it. And it's a different approach. It's more, from my perspective, it's a more practical approach, but it's, again, returning to the same, it's always be reactive. It's like trying to solve the problems of today and not trying to solve the problems of like in a month. So I think that we'll see in the upcoming year or two big changes there also, because they are also understanding that the government cannot simply be the defender. There cannot be a data police per se by a government, because it's not scalable today.
Great, thank you. Just one more, a couple of questions more. In this legislation, Europe is, or not in the legislation, but in the strategy, in the data strategy of the European Commission, they are promoting one technology, which is data spaces. I don't know if you are familiar with that. As a let's say, a governance tool to share data between companies and respecting sovereignty and of the data. Enrique, could you give us one?
Well,
of the relation between these legislations and how data spaces can help companies to.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh,
okay.
yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you, guys.
Okay.
So Just
Okay.
1 minute.
1 minute. Okay. So sorry for that. So I will not be. Well, probably. I guess that most of you know what is the data space. During this morning, most of the people were talking about data lakes, data warehouses, and all these kind of things. From what they think to be a data spaces is like coming the business part in front of the data lake. It's just there is business behind, it's market behind. Okay, so you have data products, then you have, it's a little bit when you were mentioning about the data mesh, okay, with federation, decentralization, how you manage the interchange with the contrast, all the kind of things. So blocks and the same governance building blocks. With the idea that all the data products can be just being shared, can be, of course, bring value into the different data spaces, but also between the different between data spaces for tourism, for example, weather or any other that's coming. So it's to make it short, and sometimes it's we say how. In fact, we make a small exercise on how to convince a company to move from a data lake to a data space. What will be the benefits and from moving them on? And if you're curious, just go to the SEC. They are going just to publish a blueprint. They finished the 0.5 version recently, so they will be released by the end of September. And there you have a lot of information. So I don't want to extend. So that's, I invite you to go there. And also you will see how Europe is just moving on in this sense for data spaces. So that you have your time.
Just Ben, if you want to, sorry, Andrew, if you want to add something to the, I don't know if you are familiar with data spaces technology in Europe or.
I'm not overly familiar, I have to say. I do agree that all these things, when they come down to trust and federation, I mean, we're anchoring back to a central trusted authority somewhere. I guess I can do nothing but spread fear from this perspective. Obviously, with the opening up of so much data, the requirements for anonymization and scrubbing of personally identifying information from these things, it comes back to this question of who do we trust, what underpins the trust in the infrastructure that's doing the work for us, and is that federated model done in a way that, for example, has short-lived keys and fast rotation and all that kind of thing. But I'm familiar, other than sort of abstract security hand-waving on that, I'm afraid.
Yeah, well, in fact, I want just to remark a little bit when they say that Europe will share data when they trust each other. So trust is prime importance, and that's also the basis of all this. So the trust plane is going to be the key.
Okay, so I don't know if you have much more.
Okay, good. So we see occasionally in the news about data breaches, but I imagine there are quite a few that we're not hearing about. When is it an organization's job to notify? Just to walk us through that. In particular, we're talking about large-scale organizations, ones that are managing healthcare data, that are going to be recipients of a lot of attacks. You often hear from people in the security world about there are two types of companies, the ones that know they've been hacked and the ones that don't. And then we could add a third category, the ones that talk about it. What are the main cases that have caught your attention over time? And what does it say about how this information is publicly shared, how it should be publicly shared, how postmortems are done? What are your thoughts on that? Andy?
Yeah, I think an organization which is fully discursive and transparent about a breach, about the mechanism of intrusion, about the potential implications, they engender confidence that the organization understands technically exactly what they're doing. And of course, the first thing to do with a breach is to try and remediate the original point of compromise. So on the one hand, you have sort of full transparency to whatever depth is appropriate. And we can look at some of the private key leaks out of Microsoft recently to kind of get a view on this and sort of how long it takes to perform a post-mortem for a large number of services. At the other end of the scale, if you don't know that you haven't been, if you don't know that you've been breached, well then there's no public display of competence that you can actually fly a flag for. In the middle, then you have something like the Uber CEO from a couple of years ago who discovered that they were breached, chose to negotiate with the attackers, and then didn't inform the board. That suggests that probably there is a lack of confidence from that individual in maybe his team or the infrastructure behind him, and you know it leads you to, I mean, sadly not to change to a different ride share because there's a bit of a market capture going on depending on which country you're in. But yeah, the confidence levels there are directly related to the technical decomposition and transparency with the problem.
Okay. Well, I don't know if that this will make sense. But I also was thinking on, we try to make an exercise how to convince companies just to move to data spaces from the business perspective, okay, so as a data provider or as a data consumer. And because you know, there is a lot of implication for a company just moving from the status where they are now. They are comfortable, but they are doing business the way they are. But the future is just inviting them just to move for sharing their data. So what will be the benefits? And well, we were in the middle of a conference, and someone is saying, okay, you have the cloud there. Why the companies are not moving to the cloud? Okay. Some of the reasons were they didn't have the skilled people. I was also mentioned in the slide before. Some of them they say, okay, we don't get the benefits. The ROI is not pretty much. The reason was, okay, of course there will be benefits, but all the cost of just migrating my current status into the new one, from my perspective, it will the savings that I will make from the operational cost will be more or less the same thing that I will get in return, unless I have new ways of revenue. And that's a little bit, I know, I mean, there's a lot of, we usually talk about technical implications. As a data consumer, the story is completely different, but as a data provider, they need to be shown that there will be money coming out of that. There will be new sources of revenue, and that will be the only way so that they move forward. So that's, it's not governance, it's not security, it's all of them at the same time. The technical part has to be there, but somehow we also need just to bring the message that, okay, come on guys, there is, you need to trust this is going to work, and returns the revenue that you will get by sharing just going to this data economy will be great. Okay. So that's an invitation.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so I wanted to know your opinion on, well, we talked about the big players on the scene, right? How do these regulations affect all the small players, all the small businesses that have to implement things that might take a great overhead over what they currently have? What is your opinion on that?
It's the same with all of these regulations. I think GDPR with cookie consent notices and unsubscribing and data access for third parties to come and sort of see what your mailing list looks like. There is a huge overhead. Potentially, it's also then a sort of an opportunity for a startup to come and provide these things as a service. I think the complexity here is a lot more than just with a cookie pop-up, for example. So yeah, there's definitely, in terms of percentage revenue expenditure on complying here, it's going to come down so much harder on small organizations. The only thing when these kind of things come up is potentially for governments to provide some sort of support fund, perhaps, but I defer to greater knowledge.
Well, I will give you my opinion coming from a startup, okay? Because I suffered that. And well, we were part of this. You know, a startup, you might need a lot of cost of that, but they are the early adopters. They are the fast movers. They are one that just to move if they see there is a business behind. The big companies, they will take much more time to migrate into the new data spaces. So if they react fast, they will get money fast. And so usually when I try just to engage people, I say, you usually focus all your messages to the big companies and forget the startups and the small companies. And the ones that they will see if there is business behind are the startups. So please just change your message and also just invite the people just to collaborate.
I would add also that the legislation already thinks of that, and it's not. It gives more time to SMEs and all that to turn. So.
Very good. That being said, round of applause for our panel. We will now take a coffee break, and so we'll come back in 15 minutes.